Hi, welcome. We are going to talk today about Emma Goldman. She was called America's Most Dangerous Woman and in her connections to Forest Park. So Emma Goldman, like I said, she was called the most dangerous woman in America. She was also called Red Emma, a modern Joan of Arc, mother of anarchy, mother of non-monogamy, and the high priestess of anarchy. She had quite the reputation. She was very famous, very well known. And so I wanted to start off talking a little bit about herself. So she was an anarchist, an organizer, an agitator, also an author, very famously a free spirit. A lot of people described her as being very fiery, powerful, eloquent, extremely witty. She's super funny, and most importantly, uncompromising. And she was an advocate for causes: free speech, free love, free thought, women's equality, birth control, workers' rights and unions, the right to organize, free universal education. She was an advocate of homosexuality and racial equality. So people would talk about her when she would speak, and they would say sometimes that she was possessed, that she had like a magnetic force, a magnetic power. She was very eloquent and almost like she was on fire. And historian Howard Zinn said of her, she was a free spirit, bold, speaking out against all authority, unafraid, living her life as she wanted to live it, not as the rules and regulations and authorities were telling her how to live it. She was a very powerful voice. I also want to talk a little bit about, so she's a very famous anarchist. And nowadays when we hear anarchism, we tend to think of it as being a very violent movement. And that is not what Emma Goldman interpreted anarchism as. She interpreted it as being freedom, as being free from organized religion, organized governments. And here's a couple of quotes from her about anarchism. Anarchism stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion, the liberation of the human body from the dominion of poverty, and the liberation of property, the liberation from the shackles and restraint of government. And it stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals. So she believed very much if you took away the rules and regulations of a government, that people on their own would form cooperative communities, and that they would live in harmony without an overriding government with all of its rules and regulations that eventually became corrupt. She also said that anarchism alone stresses the importance of the individual, his possibilities and his needs in a free society. And as we see Emma Goldman's evolution in her approach towards anarchy, she sort of made it her own to include sexuality and sexual identity. But we'll talk about her life now. So she was born in 1869. So there's her official birth date is June 27th, but she was born in Lithuania, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time and which was on the Russian calendar. So I'm not 100% sure if June 27th is from the Russian calendar or a modern day calendar. But June 27th, 1869. And when she was born, where she was living was part of a very repressive Tsarist regime. And she also had a very strict and violent father. And Emma was born to his second wife, and he had very much been hoping for a boy. He did eventually get sons, but Emma was the first born in that second marriage, and sometimes it seems as though he had taken it out on Emma that she had been born a girl. In 1876, the family moves to Germany, and Emma goes to some German schools where she has very strict teachers, where they hit her with rulers. Apparently she's already an unruly child. Eventually, Tsar Alexander is assassinated and the family moves to St. Petersburg. And Emma's taken out of school. She's not allowed to return to school, and she starts to work in a factory. The conditions in the factory are pretty brutal, and she also describes in her autobiography sexual assault is going on in that factory. But at the same time, she's still very much interested in political activism and radicalism. And she's inspired particularly by the novel that is called What Is to Be Done. And in it, there's a female protagonist who organizes people that are, being repressed, and it very much inspires Emma. And she refers to it, I think, throughout the most of her life. When she's 15, her father decides to marry her off in an arranged marriage, and she's horrified. And she very much refuses to go along with this arranged marriage, threatening to drown herself in the river. So her father relents and lets her move to the United States with her sister, Helena. Emma says that when she leaves the old world and she comes to America, that she casts off the old world like a well-worn garment. She ends up settling in Rochester with her sister Lena. From 1886 to 1888, she works as a garment worker in Rochester, and she, witnesses the terrible working conditions of workers now during the Industrial Revolution and how tough it is. She realizes this firsthand. Her parents end up joining them in the United States because they're fleeing anti-Semitism in Russia. During the same time is when the events of the Haymarket are happening. So 1886 to 1887 is when the Haymarket trial is very much in the newspapers, and Emma and her sisters are following it breathlessly. And Emma says that the plight of these anarchists who are, unjustly accused of this bombing and the unjust trial is what is her political awakening. And as she starts to really understand the movement that the Haymarket 8 were advocating for, she decides to dedicate herself to their cause, so the cause of anarchy. She was also moved by a speech that she saw by Johanna Gree, again, talking about the events of the Haymarket and just how unjust their trial was. She starts to become familiar with anarchist literature, particularly literature written by Johann Most, who writes for the Die Freiheit. And he's a very fiery anarchist who, part of his political theory is the propaganda of the deed. So he believes that violence or an assassination is what is needed to spark a revolution. Propaganda of the deed, and that'll come back later. She ends up marrying a factory worker named Jacob Kirstner. They have similar tastes in literature, and she finds him a pleasing companion. And because of this, she also gets her U.S. citizenship. But on the night of the wedding, she realizes that he's impotent, and this physical closeness is very important to Emma. And he also has a more traditional idea of what Emma should be as a housewife, and of course, Emma bristles against that. But she says during this period of time, she's very unhappy in this new marriage. She is saved by her interest in the Haymarket Martyrs, and so or the Haymarket Affair at the time before they were hanged, and she throws herself into the news of the Haymarket anarchists. On November 11th of 1887, the Haymarket Martyrs are hanged, and right about that same time, she gets a separation from her husband. This is shocking to the community, especially to her parents. She moves to New Haven and she works in a corset factory. She finalizes her divorce, and she's shunned by her parents and the Jewish community that she'd been living in. In 1889, she decides to move to New York City. So she leaves Rochester with $5 in her pocket, which is about the equivalent of $150 in our money, and a sewing machine. Almost immediately after she arrives in New York, she goes to Saks Cafe. And this is a cafe where a lot of immigrants go and they talk about politics. It's a very vibrant scene. People of different nationalities are there. A lot of political talk. Emma feels like she is home when she walks in here. And most importantly, she meets two men that are incredibly important for the rest of her life. One is Alexander Berkman, whom Emma calls Sasha, and Johann Most, whom she had been reading his publication before, and now she meets him in person. She ends up working at Johann Most's publication, and Most takes a very passionate interest in Emma. Not only does he see her as a very energetic and passionate and smart woman, but he's also attracted to her youth, and he finds her very appealing, and he takes her under his wing, and he says, "You're going to be my voice when I stop speaking. You're going to continue, my political life." So he sends her out on a lecture tour, and at first he really grills her to speak what he wants, and Johann Most wanted her to go out and give speeches. So the anarchists at the time, so even though the 8-hour workday was something that people were fighting for, Johann Most and other anarchists thought that that was too low of a bar. That what really should happen is that capitalism should be done away with, and that if workers are concentrating on just getting an 8-hour workday, they're distracting themselves from the higher goals of having more important rights. But Emma goes out and she's supposed to do this speech by Most, and at her very first speaking engagement, she forgets what she's supposed to talk about. She forgets about the notes. She starts to panic, but then she starts to improvise, and she speaks from her own experience, and she finds herself almost transported by her own words. And it's really cool. I highly recommend that you read her autobiography, Living My Life. And she talks about this moment where nowadays we would call it flow. So she feels like she's almost out of her body and her words are just taking over and she's just on fire. And she realizes this is what she's supposed to do in her life. But she gets done with the speech, she feels great, and she gets off the stage and somebody says, well, what about the 8-hour workday? And she realized that she hasn't spoken about it. Later on in the same tour, she goes to another speaking engagement, and she sort of incorporates talking about Most's theory about the 8-hour workday, and she makes it her own, and she feels like the speech is a success, that she's getting a lot of applause. And at the end, she's taking questions, and an older gentleman stands up in the audience, and he says, I understand what you're saying, and I understand what you mean about that we should have loftier goals than the 8-hour workday, but I'm an old man, and I'm not going to live to see your new society, and all I want is a couple of extra hours in a day. And Emma realizes that when she doesn't speak sincerely for the needs of the people, that she's not being sincere. So she comes back from this tour, and Johann Most meets her, and he has roses for her, and she's excited to talk about what she discovered as she's speaking and how she found her own voice. And it seems like Most mostly wants to be physically close to Emma. And she's, disillusioned. She wants to talk about the political things and he wants more of a physical relationship. So they have a big fight. And Johann Most says, I have raised a viper and, you are now against me. So she has a break with Most and she strikes on her own with Alexander Berkman. And she moves in an apartment with him and his cousin and another gal, Helen Minkin. And she starts to lecture in New York City and Newark, testing out these new powers that she finds with her voice. She ends up recruiting women to go on strike. She organizes a cooperative to earn money to fight political repression. And she forms an anarchist education group in New Haven, and she lectures in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Baltimore. And there's a great quote that she has. She says, I was conscious only of my own words, of my ecstatic song. So that just speaks to how she's discovering who she is. In 1891, she helps organize the first May Day celebration in New York City to honor the Haymarket Martyrs. The celebration was organized also with socialists, and the socialists, anarchism had sort of fallen out of favor, and the socialists did not want to let any anarchists have the platform at the celebration. So Emma, being Emma, she stands up on the back of a wagon and she starts delivering a speech about anarchism. Well, the organizers of the event see what Emma's doing, so they hitch horses to the wagon and they start to pull the wagon as Emma is speaking, but the crowd starts to follow her. So because Emma doesn't even know what's going on, eventually they have to pull her down off of the wagon. But it just shows that even radicals were a little bit intimidated by Emma Goldman and the power of her speech. Johann Most is separately imprisoned for some of his activities, and she actually goes and she speaks on his behalf. So even though they had that break in between the two of them, she still honors him as an anarchist. In 1892, she opens up a photography and ice cream business with Alexander Berkman, and they were hoping to use the funds for that again to help people fight political repression. And their goal was to return to Russia and protest against the Tsar. I want to take this opportunity to talk about, and a lot of times you'll see a quote that's not exactly what Emma Goldman said about, if I can't dance during the revolution, I don't want to dance, or something to that effect. The actual story, and she elaborates it in her autobiography, is that she was at a party and she was dancing with abandon because she liked to dance. And a cousin of Alexander Berkman's came up to her and said, this is unbecoming of somebody, that, your frivolity is going to hurt the cause. And she became furious. And she told him, she said, mind your own business. And she said, I did not believe that a cause which stood for a beautiful ideal, for anarchism, for release and freedom from convention and prejudice, should demand the denial of life and joy. If it meant that, I did not want it. So that's more what her quote was. And then she also said, I want freedom, the right to self-expression, everybody's right to beautiful, radiant things. Anarchism meant that to me, and I would live it in spite of the whole world, prisons, persecution, everything. Yes, even in spite of the condemnation of my own closest comrades, I would live my beautiful ideal. And we're going to see that come to play in a little bit, how Emma kind of pisses off other anarchists. In 1892, there was a Homestead steel strike, and the workers were on strike for rights. And this was a steel company that was owned by Andrew Carnegie. But Carnegie left the running of the plant to Henry Clay Frick, who was the manager. And he was infamous for breaking strikes, and he hires an army of Pinkerton guards. And the Pinkertons were a private security agency that was, infamous for their strong arm tactics at breaking up strikes. So Henry Clay Frick sends in these Pinkerton guards. There's a huge battle between the workers and the guards, and 7 to 9 workers die and 3 to 7 guards die during this battle. So it's infamous. People are up in arms. And so Goldman and Berkman, again, being inspired by this whole idea of the propaganda of the deed, decide that they should assassinate Frick. And then what they're hoping for is once Frick dies, the workers will take over the plant and it will start a revolution from that deed. So at first they make some homemade bombs and they go out and they test them and it fails spectacularly. And then they decide that Berkman on his own is going to go with a gun and a knife to Frick. And they decide that Emma should stay home, and so that after Alexander Berkman's going to be the deed and she's going to be the propaganda. So and they assumed that he was going to be martyred, that he'd be killed after doing this, and that Emma was supposed to then tell the world what had happened. At the same time, Emma decides that she's going to need to start making money, and she tries getting work as a prostitute, and the story goes, so the first gentleman that she solicits, she takes him to a cafe, and the guy gives her some money and says, "You're not very good at this, and you shouldn't do this anymore." So Emma realizes she can't have a career as a prostitute to raise money for Alexander Berkman. Okay, so July 23rd, 1892, Alexander Berkman gets into the office with Henry Clay Frick, and he shoots him a couple times, misses or just grazes him. They're on the floor tussling. He stabs him a couple times in the leg. Workers rush in to not take care of Frick, but to get rid of Berkman. And Frick actually says, "Don't kill him. I think I'm going to survive this." And so Berkman is arrested for this assassination attempt. The police then, of course, seize Emma's papers. She's evicted from her apartment. While Berkman is on trial, a lot of the anarchists turn against Alexander Berkman. They're like, this is too far. And they said that, the American workers did not revolt. The American workers actually saw this as a big step backwards in their strike, because now the police and public opinion were against them because of this assassination attempt. They thought that they were going to make more progress by advocating for their rights, and here they turned this tragedy of what happened with the Pinkerton guards now into a circus because of this assassination attempt. So at one point, Johann Most is giving a speech about disagreeing with Berkman, and Emma Goldman shows up at the speech to defend Berkman, and in fact she takes to the stage with a little whip and beats Johann Most in public and breaks the whip. Later on she says, she apologizes for it because she says, when you're 23 years old, your passions take over. But eventually, on September 19th of 1892, Alexander Berkman is sentenced to 22 years in prison. Emma is lecturing when she finds out this sentence, and pandemonium is ensued at the lecture, and she was arrested, and they tried to tie her to the assassination attempt, but there was not enough evidence, and they had to let her go. Later that year, Emma meets and falls in love with a man named Edward Brady, and in her autobiography, she describes sort of a sexual revelation. She understands now why everybody falls in love and wants to have sex. This was the first time that she really understood how important sex can be to the human condition. And then here's a really great quote that I just want before we move on. So like I said, the assassination attempt was very unpopular. It was unpopular in the press. It was unpopular with a lot of anarchists. And Emma Goldman actually was not an advocate of violence. In fact, she says violence never has and never will bring constructive results, but change will always be violent. So it's a kind of a nuanced understanding of the role in violence and political change. In 1893, there's an economic panic in the United States and a depression, and unemployment is incredibly high. Over 20% of people are off work. And so Emma, in August of 1893, leads a procession of 3,000 unemployed people and anarchists in New York City to Union Square. And she tells the crowd to demand bread. So there's a disagreement on what exactly Emma said. Emma said that she said, demonstrate before the palaces of the rich, demand work. If they do not give you work, demand bread. If they deny you bread, take bread. Now, police officers who were in the crowd said that she went further and she talked about robbing the rich, but she said this was what she said. So she is arrested shortly after for inciting to riot, and she's sentenced to a penitentiary for 1 year. On her the train ride, she's with one of the officers, and they said, we'll reduce your sentence if you give names of other anarchists. And she throws her glass of water in his face. She refuses to name names. While she's in the penitentiary, she actually was sick for a little bit and went to the infirmary, and she ended up meeting a physician there and got training as a nurse. So while she's in the penitentiary, she's learning nursing skills, she's taking care of the other inmates, and she also reads widely. So she reads Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, whom she understands as brilliant American anarchists. In 1894, she's released out of prison, and there's a large anarchist gathering in New York to welcome her back. Voltairine de Cleyre, who is another well-known woman anarchist, speaks at this event. And then she ends up wanting to continue her training in nursing, and she was mostly interested in being a midwife and a masseuse, and she couldn't get that training in the United States, so she goes to Europe to get that training. So she goes to Europe for that training, and when she comes back, she decides to give speeches. So my note says she decides to give speeches in English. So maybe up until now she's mostly speaking in Russian and maybe German. And then she moves in with Edward Brady. She starts speaking about female emancipation and sex, free love, and homosexuality. And so here we see one schism with the anarchists. Some of the anarchists were like, Emma, they already treat us as though we're degenerates. Why are you throwing sex into the equation? And very famously, Lucy Parsons, who was the martyr of one of the Haymarket Martyrs, a very well-known firebrand anarchist, has a falling out with Emma Goldman because she starts to talk about sexual expression, sexual freedom. She has a very heated discussion with another famous anarchist, Peter Kropotkin, and he's like, anarchism does not mean sexual freedom, and they're going back and forth and back and forth. And then this shows Emma's brilliant wit. And at this time, Peter Kropotkin is much older than Emma. And she says, well, when I reached your age, the sex question may no longer be of importance to me, but it is now. And he laughs and he's like, okay, I understand your point. In 1901, she gives a speech, The Modern Phase of Anarchy. And she talks about, within that speech, she talks about political assassination and the glory of martyrdom. And I'm sure she's making references to the Haymarket Martyrs. And remember, Alexander Berkman is still in prison, and she always wanted to honor his sacrifice for the cause. But in that crowd is a young man named Leon Czolgosz, and he said that Emma's speech set him on fire. Now, this gentleman had approached Emma after the speech, and Emma said that she felt there was a little bit something off about him, and he even approached other anarchists to try to become part of the crowd, and there was something so off about him that they even thought that maybe he was a police detective, in disguise, meant to infiltrate them. So he was kind of kept at arm's length from the anarchists. And on September 6th of 1901, after he saw Emma's speech, he shoots President McKinley in Buffalo. Emma is immediately arrested because Leon Czolgosz says that Emma had inspired him. She was released because there was no evidence against her besides just this young man saying he inspired her. But Emma speaks out that she offers because she has experience as a nurse. McKinley very famously lingered for days after he was shot. She offers to nurse McKinley. But really importantly, she does not condemn Czolgosz. Everybody else condemns him. He should not have shot an American president. The anarchists, turn against him. And Emma is like, this is a poor, deluded young man. He's human. And because even Alexander Berkman condemns Czolgosz, but Emma's like, he's a human, just like all of us. And this also gives anarchists sort of a black eye. It kind of affects the reputation of anarchists. And so even though Emma says, I'm anti-violent, she's still unwilling to condemn this man who assassinated a US president. So at this point, too, unions start to distance themselves from the anarchist movement. Here's another quote by Emma about violence. As an anarchist, I'm opposed to violence, but if people want to do away with assassins, they must first do away with the conditions which produce murderers. And I'm filming this in 2025. We just recently saw someone, assassinate the head of a health company, and you can see echoes of the same sentiment. Nobody wants violence, but they can understand why the inequity or the injustice inspires somebody to violence. So it's something that unfortunately resonates today. After all of this, after the assassination of the president, Emma Goldman retreats from public view for a while. She ends up working as a nurse in the tenements of New York, and she goes under the alias of E.G. Smith. She felt for a little while that she had lost her identity, and she was depressed. But pretty soon she can't help herself. There was an anarchist exclusion act that had been passed in the United States, and that outraged Emma, and so she ends up going back and giving speeches against this exclusion act. In 1907, she starts to publish the monthly magazine Mother Earth, and it's devoted to social sciences and literature. And it's her apartment where they write and work on the publication, and it becomes this hot seat of writers and eccentrics. And she said she called it her home for lost dogs. In May of 1907, Berkman is released. He's finally out of prison. Emma goes to meet him after he's released. She's got a bouquet of flowers for him, but they find it incredibly difficult. He's changed dramatically from being in prison. And Emma obviously has changed. She's grown as a speaker and as an advocate for rights. And they find that they don't have as much in common. They try to reignite their romance, but it kind of fizzles. And Berkman has lost his way. He doesn't know where his place in life, and he becomes depressed and talks about suicide. But then Emma is arrested, and that makes Berkman reignited to help for her defense. So he's like, okay, now we have to fight for our freedom of assembly. Emma was arrested for speaking, and they came and arrested her for what she was saying, and he's like, there has to be a freedom for assembly. And so Berkman is reignited, and he gets his feet back underneath him, and he takes over Mother Earth while Emma is in jail, and then he continues to edit it while she goes out on a lecture circuit. In 1908, Emma meets Ben Reitman. Ben Reitman is an amazingly interesting fellow. He was called the King of the Hobos or the Hobo Doctor. He was a hobo, and a distinction for a hobo is a man who travels the rails looking for work. And so he ended up getting a job in Chicago as a janitor at a medical center, and the doctors there recognized that he was a very intelligent man, and they helped him get his MD. So he becomes a doctor, and he becomes what's called a whorehouse physician. So he takes care of people in poor circumstances, and his clientele are prostitutes and other hobos. He's 10 years younger than Emma, but they have this immediate chemistry between the two of them. So again, Emma believed in free love, and she talked against the institution of marriage. You should be able to love who you want, however many people you want, no matter what the gender is. But when she starts the affair with Ben Reitman, unfortunately, she discovers that she does have some jealousy. Ben takes her to heart, and he's not monogamous with Emma, and it pained Emma very much. But they have a very tempestuous relationship. You can find their love letters to each other, which are incredibly steamy, even by our standards today. But the other thing is that Ben Reitman is very smart, and he knows how to be a promoter, and he starts to be her manager. And he himself is a very public speaker, a very good public speaker. And up until now, Emma's audiences were primarily other anarchists or other people that, of the similar political persuasion. But now he starts to book her at places that are more middle class. And so like ladies' clubs and things like that. And this is controversial to some of the anarchists. They're like, what is happening? Why are you speaking to these middle class people? But Ben Reitman sees it as a way to not only further their cause, but to also make Emma more well known. So she goes to ladies' clubs, union halls, private homes. Wherever they go, they're dogged by the authorities. They keep trying to shut her down for what she's talking about. She speaks on such topics as the failure of Christianity, and she openly criticizes Billy Sunday, who was a very conservative preacher at the time. And she also starts to talk about birth control, and she supports Margaret Sanger. She sells Margaret Sanger's publications at her speeches. And in 1916, she ends up being arrested and sentenced to 15 days in the workhouse for her speeches on birth control. So there was a Comstock Act that was against what they said pornography at the time, and they considered talking about contraception and contraceptive methods as being pornography. She was sentenced to 15 days. Ben Reitman was arrested, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and that was the longest sentence ever for somebody violating the Comstock Act at that time. You'll see, I'm sure that will be on your screen, that there is a slide that has all of the headlines for when Emma's on tour with Ben Reitman. And I love some of these are Emma Goldman and Ben Reitman and William Girk are taken out of the city by police, and Emma's arrested, and Emma may be choked off by the police. So it made, not only was controversial and made for good press, but it also packed all of the halls where Emma was speaking, because everywhere she went, everybody expected something to happen. In 1917, Ben Reitman and Emma split up, and unfortunately for Emma, Ben Reitman actually found a woman that he wanted to settle down with. So not only was that bitter for her, but here was what she had wanted, and he found somebody else to settle down with. In April that same year, the U.S. enters World War I, and the U.S. passes the Selective Services Espionage Act and Sedition Law. And at the same time, J. Edgar Hoover starts to become involved in American politics, and he especially targets foreign-born and what he calls intellectual perverts. And he very much has Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman in his crosshairs. He was the one who said that she was the most dangerous woman in America. Emma and Alexander Berkman are horrified by the Selective Services Act. They start to protest the draft for World War I, and they form what they call a no conscription league. And they give speeches about this, about how people should not be registering for the draft. And Emma said, why should a baker's son from the United States go and kill a baker's son in Germany? That it made no sense, and that she believed that World War I was just a way for the capitalists to make money, and the industrial, the industrial complex, to sell weaponry, and it's all the workers that end up suffering, and not the capitalists at the top of the chain. So they have these raucous meetings where people are getting very energized. June of that year, the Mother Earth offices are raided, and then Emma and Alexander Berkman are arrested for these speeches, for the protesting the draft, and they're sentenced to 22 months for violating the Draft Act. Right about this same time, in November 6th, was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which is what a lot of the anarchists were waiting for. They were waiting for somewhere for there to be a revolution. So in 1919, there's the Red Scare of the Palmer raids in the United States. So what they were doing is they were rounding up radicals that they wanted to get out of the United States. So in September of 1919, Emma and Alexander Berkman are released. They're released for protesting the draft. and then they're right away imprisoned as part of the Palmer raids, this first Red Scare in the United States, and they're sent to Ellis Island as enemy aliens. And Emma says, well, I'm a U.S. citizen. This doesn't apply to me. But what they did is her first husband, his citizenship was revoked. So they said, therefore, Emma's citizenship was revoked. So in December 21st of 1919, Emma and Alexander Berkman are deported from the United States along with 248 other radicals because of the Sedition Act. And as Emma and these radicals are on the boat leaving, newspaper man quipped, with Prohibition coming in and Emma Goldman going out, 'twill be a dull country. And then you'll see there's a cartoon, and this is very much the feelings in the United States at that time. So it's Uncle Sam very violently eradicating the United States of these radicals. And in this cartoon, I think it's interesting to see they have members of the IWW portrayed almost like an animal. So it's very hairy, very rabid, and then in the other hand, they're holding bomb throwers and traitors to the United States. So that was very much the mood of the United States at the time, get them out of here. So Emma, at first, as she's transported to the United States, she first ends up in Finland, and then she makes her way into Russia. And she's hoping that finally she's going to see, you know, the revolution that they've been hoping for, and instead she's greeted with just devastation. People are starving on the streets, it's chaos, it's a lot of repression. She's horrified by what she sees. And she and Berkman end up being able to have a meeting with Lenin. They want to talk to them. They're seeing free speech being repressed on the streets. And because it was a communist revolution, the anarchists were being oppressed. And they're like, we thought the revolution meant that there was going to be free speech. And Lenin says to them, it's a bourgeois superstition, that there should not be, and when you're in the midst of a revolution, you cannot afford free speech. So she's horrified. And then her mind is finally made up when the Bolsheviks, it was the Kronstadt Rebellion, and the Bolsheviks absolutely crushed the last remains of an anarchist group in Kronstadt. And Emma's like, that's it, this is not what I thought the revolution was going to be. So they leave Russia. Emma spends time writing My 2 Years in Russia, which she ends up renaming My Disillusionment in Russia. So she wants to tell everybody this is what's actually happening in Russia. And again, here's another wedge between her and the movement that she was associated with, because people in the United States and in Europe were still counting on the Russian Revolution being what they had hoped for, and they didn't want to hear that it had gone awry. And so they were like, Emma, what are you talking about? This put another wedge between her and the other radicals. Her status in Europe is in question. She doesn't really have a home, and Emma always considered her home America. She said she spent her really formative years in America, and she really wanted to go back to America. But now she's adrift in Europe, and she doesn't know where she can stay. So a Welsh miner who she had met but didn't know very well volunteers to marry her so that she can get a British passport. So she marries James Colton, and she ends up with a British passport. Then she lives throughout Europe with friends in France and Canada and England, and then they end up, friends of hers raise a lot of money, and they end up getting her a little cottage in the French Riviera where they want her to write her autobiography, which is incredible. And to help with the autobiography, she asks a lot of friends, can you send me letters I sent you to refresh my memory? And they do. She lives apart from Berkman. Berkman really interestingly has a relationship with a very much younger anarchist. And at one point, I think Emma says you can't blame him for being with such a younger woman, because in a weird way his life was stopped when he ended up going to prison, and she can take care of him. But they continue their very close friendship, and they correspond all the time. And there was one quote from one of their correspondents that I wanted to point out. Berkman writes to Emma, "There's not much to congratulate ourselves on, is there, dear? Except that after all these years, our old friendship has remained unchanged, and indeed stronger and more understanding and intimate than ever, and that is a great deal." So they're disappointed that they haven't changed the world, but they can honor their friendship together. Emma publishes her autobiography, Living My Life. At first, she wanted it to be in 2 volumes, and she wanted it to be cheap so that anybody could afford it, but the publisher ends up charging more than she'd wanted to, and she was irritated. But she gets able to go on a speaking tour in the United States. So the U.S. says, okay, well, you can stay in the U.S. for 90 days, but all you're allowed to talk about is the book and the topic of drama. So Emma would give speeches, and then she would talk about the drama of political revolutions. She was still kind of trying to push that envelope. Everywhere she went, she was trailed by the FBI. It's just heartbreaking how she visits her family who are still in Rochester, New York, and she just pines to be back in the United States. There's on the slide you will see there are links to, there's this great video footage of her being interviewed while she is home in the United States. I think it's super interesting that she does not have a heavy Russian accent. A lot of times when you see Emma portrayed, especially in a musical, Ragtime, the actress usually portrays her with a very thick Russian accent, but she doesn't in that little clip where she's being interviewed. And you can also see her amazing wit. I think at one point they say, you know, Emma, what do you think about Italy? And she was like, a beautiful country minus Mussolini. So really interesting wit. But look up those links yourself. It's a great little clip. In 1935, you know, of course, she's, you know, back out of the United States, but she continues to speak against fascism of Hitler and communism in Russia. In 1936, after a long illness, Alexander Berkman ends up shooting himself in the chest. He doesn't die immediately, so Emma rushes to his side, and he dies the same evening that Emma arrives. Emma writes that the largest part of her life followed Berkman to the grave, and she is very distraught, and her friends are very concerned about her. And here's something that she wrote to Berkman. Someday, sometime long after we are gone, liberty may again raise its proud head. It is up to us to blaze the way. Dim as our torch may seem today, it is still the one flame. So they fought for their beliefs for 47 years. So Emma's very depressed. Her friends are very worried about her after Berkman dies. But then in 1936 is the Spanish Revolution. And it's a social revolution against fascism. And there's a community of anarchists that actually are able to set up an anarchist system in Spain. Emma, this reignites her, so she can be very depressed in her personal life, but if her ideals somewhere are being sparked, it brings her back to life. So she travels to Barcelona to support the workers and the socialists. She tells an audience of 10,000 people, you know, that you are a shining example. She believes that their revolution is going to destroy forever the idea that anarchism stands for chaos, because the society they have set up is peaceful. She's thrilled to see it work. They all honor her. They tell her that she is her spiritual mother. But it doesn't last very long. Before 3 years are out, the revolution fails, and Emma's again heartbroken. And she says it's as though you had wanted a child all your life and only to see it die right after it's born. So poor Emma, all that she's been through. So in 1940, she's in Canada and she's playing cards with her friends. And I think supposedly her last words were, God damn it, why did you lead with that? Because they're playing cards. And then she has a stroke. She has a stroke in February. She doesn't die until May. But people found it very ironic that after she had her stroke, she could still hear and react to people, but she could not speak. So people say no government in the world could stop her from speaking, but a stroke did. Emma requested that she be buried near the Haymarket Martyrs. And so her body was allowed back in the United States. Her coffin was draped with the revolutionary flag from Spain. She's buried in Waldheim, Forest Home Cemetery. Her headstone is beautiful. There is a bronze plaque portrait of Emma on it that was sculpted by Joe Davison. Unfortunately, the stonecutter made some mistakes on the dates. They had the year wrong. She died in 1940, not 1939. And again, like I mentioned, the date on the headstone says June 29th. Other people say she was born on June 27th. And again, was that the old Russian calendar? But regardless, the headstone is beautiful, and it is visited by many, many people. And you can see in the photograph, many gifts are left to Emma. Like I said earlier, she And Billy Sunday had a very public falling out between the two of them, sort of a feud between the two of them. Billy Sunday is also born in Forest Park, in Forest Home. Nobody visits Billy Sunday's grave, and many, many people visit Emma Goldman's grave. When Emma was laid to rest, Roger Baldwin gave the eulogy, and he said that Emma inspired him to found the ACLU. Also buried near, so Emma is within, view of the Haymarket Martyrs Monument. Also buried nearby is Ben Reitman, her lover, and Voltairine de Cleyre, whom I said was a female anarchist. And then some opponents are buried near her, like I said, Billy Sunday and Lucy Parsons. I wanted to acknowledge Mark Rogovin. I had the great good fortune of giving the tours, monthly tours at the Haymarket Martyrs Monument, and I learned how to give those tours and found the passion for the stories of the Haymarket from Mark Rogovin. And then there's a list of my references, and again, highly recommend that you read Emma's book, Living My Life. You get it straight, and you can see all the, you get the words straight from Emma. So thank you. I encourage you all to learn more about Emma Goldman and be inspired by her tenacity and her idealism.